First of all, thank you for taking time on Thursday night at 6 o'clock to join us. I'm very excited to have this conversation, and I'm hopeful that a few more folks will join us. But we have a really interesting panel this evening, and we have a really interesting topic this evening, something that I have been incredibly passionate about for several years. So I'm always excited to share that with others, and then to hopefully make some additional friends in the circle of small dollar campaign finance reform. What we wanted to do this evening was to share a little bit more deeply for any of you who watched our video last month that we launched, as you know, Voters Voice Initiative here in San Diego. Spent a good deal of time and energy with our partnership at Common Cause and the League of Women Voters, putting together some media about small dollar public financing in the form of democracy dollars. And we created a explainer video that we launched last month. And as a follow-up to that, we wanted to do some more activities to really build awareness of this great public policy in the space. I tell people frequently that I think small dollar campaign financing via democracy dollars or democracy vouchers, the name of which all of us are still arm wrestling over, but we're going to use both for this evening's purposes, is one of the best policies that nobody knows about that's out there. And I think that is what we are all trying to change, in part with the conversation tonight, and then with conversations going forward, is that this fantastic policy becomes better known throughout the community of San Diego and throughout the state of California. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, but then I am going to let them go into a little bit more detail because they will introduce themselves far better than I will introduce them. So first of all, we have Aura Vasquez, who is an activist and energy policy advisor. And Aura, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself for a couple of minutes before we go on to our next panelist.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Hi, Amy. Hi, everyone. I'm Aura Vasquez. It's good to be here. I live in Los Angeles, and I came to this work. I like to say that my motivation is becoming an environmental justice activist since I was a child. You know, I'm a native from Colombia, and very young I learned that there were some injustices even in my hometown, and you know, back home in Cali, Colombia, and I became an activist at age 11. You know, and this was something inspired by a show that I saw about the ozone layer, and where I became to learn back in the 80s about what we know today as climate change, and then we call it, you know, global warming. So, you know, forward 20 years later, I moved to New York City to go to school there. I became an undocumented student. I worked for a Congress member, and that's when I realized that really politics wasn't working for people like myself. And even my you know, boss wasn't just merely doing enough for communities of color or even immigrants like myself. So I felt very strongly about finding a way to really continue my activism, but also really being faithful to uplifting the struggle of people that look like me and that, you know, are people like in my own community. So I moved to California to work on immigrant rights issues. I worked on a variety of issues there. Later went to work with the Sierra Club and led the campaign to get LA off of coal. Became the youngest commissioner for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which is the largest public utility in the country. And then in 2020, like many of us that felt that it was our duty to step up against Trump and so much of other policies that were really affecting us, decided to run for city council here in Los Angeles. And one thing that I learned very quickly was that the system wasn't set up for people like me to run, and especially for people like me to participate in the process. So this is when democracy vouchers, the idea came around, it really struck me because I lived it myself. I felt it myself, what was like to, you know, go to your own community and for them to help you, but not having the resources to be able to compete with other people that are, that are maybe running and are more established, or maybe are not standing up for the things that, more progressive things that we should be standing up for. So, even in Los Angeles, we have a campaign finance program that is clearly not enough. So I'm excited to be talking about democracy vouchers with all of you, and how that manifests in candidates like myself, first-time candidates, candidates of color, women, low-income folks, and how this can really empower and repower, our communities to be part of the civic process and the electoral process. So I'm going to stop here, because I think we're going to have a very lively conversation about democracy vouchers, and I pass it back on to Amy.
Yes, excellent. So our next panelist is actually one of the founders of the historic Democracy Dollar campaign in Seattle, although he's had many fascinating roles in the world of campaign finance reform and equity and money since then. So Estevan Muñoz-Howard, can you give us a little bit more feedback on, or a little bit more information on your background, please?
Sure. Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for having me, inviting me to the panel. My name is Estevan Muñoz-Howard. I'm based in Seattle. I have been working in philanthropy for a number of years as a program officer, most recently with the Margaret Casey Foundation, as well as with the Piper Fund for many years. My work there was really centered around moving resources to support community organizing projects around the U.S. But the way that I found my path into philanthropy was really through organizing. So my history is primarily in the Seattle region. I grew up just north of Seattle in Whidbey Island. Made my way to Seattle in 2007 with an intention to organize around money and politics reform. Felt like this was just an issue that I saw as really fundamental to everything else I cared about. And in that process began organizing around money and politics reform, worked in the nonprofit sector, eventually helped found the Honest Elections Seattle initiative, which we'll talk a little bit more about, that created the first democracy voucher program that has now been implemented in 3 cycles, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more about that. But it's been really exciting to be a part of that process and to continue spreading the word so other folks can improve upon what we were able to accomplish. So thanks for having me.
We're happy to have you, and Esteban was actually very helpful as we started scripting and working on the video. So he's been very, very helpful in that effort. So next up is Tom Lukowski, and he is a policy organizer for the Democracy Policy Network. And when people say, oh, he wrote the book on democracy vouchers, Tom literally wrote a book on democracy vouchers, explaining how bringing money into politics can drive money out of politics. So Tom, you want to go ahead and give us a little bit more background on yourself?
Sure. Hi there, everybody. My name is Tom Latkowski. As Amy said, I'm a policy organizer at the Democracy Policy Network. We produce policy kits for state legislators, knowing that folks come into office, progressive folks come into office with all these bold ideas, but often don't have the support that they need once they're in office, don't have enough staff members, don't have those resources to really flesh out the policy. So I wrote our policy kit on democracy vouchers, turned that into a book as well, which is a little inside baseball, but that was my my entry into the whole name debate. At some point, we'll just have to run a poll on democracy vouchers versus dollars, and we'll settle this once and for all. But since then, I'm based in Los Angeles, and along with Mike Draskevich, who might be in the audience at the moment, co-founded Los Angeles for Democracy Vouchers a little bit over a year ago, which is how I met Aura. And since then, we've been organizing the city of Los Angeles to try and pass this policy there. So we're excited to partner with San Diego to help promote this idea in California.
I think at this point, we're going to call it a race, and we're going to say whoever wins, we all win. And hopefully we get over the finish line here in San Diego as well in LA, and Oakland is also working on a campaign. So we're going to go through a couple of questions that we've sort of pre-prepared for the panelists. We do have some points in time where we're going to want some audience feedback and participation. We actually do have a poll, but I thought I'd take a quick minute and introduce myself. My name is Amy Tobia, and I do not have all this 15 years of policy and advocacy experience. What I do have is a story of someone who's a businesswoman who works in construction and design here in San Diego, who really started realizing about 6 or 7 years ago that our political process was really unfair at the very, very beginning. And when I say it's unfair at the very, very beginning is we've excluded a lot of people before we've even given them a chance. And that has to do with how people run for office. So I put a map up on the screen that really spoke to me many, many years ago and led to me getting involved in advocating for this policy. And this is a map of San Diego. This is from several years ago. This wasn't the most recent election. And it basically shows where all of the money that's donated to our city council races and our mayoral races and all of our campaigns comes from. And as you can see from this map, all of the money, regardless of where it's going, starts in the same place. And what that says to me is that we have a system that really puts the burden on a few folks to decide for all of us who's going to run. So my voice and my vote is diluted from the very beginning before I even head to the polls because I maybe didn't have the money to influence who's going to be on the ballot. I think that's a pretty strong argument for doing something different with our elections, and that's why for the past many years I have been advocating for democracy dollars in my free time when I'm not working my day job. And so I'm going to be moderating the panel tonight and asking the questions that I've prepared of our great panelists. And then we're going to make sure that we leave some time at the end for other questions because that's usually kind of the most interesting part is hearing how other folks new to the space view this policy. So our first question, and I'm going to go in the same order. We'll do Aura, Tom, and Estevan. My first question is going to be, what experience or event in your personal life, I know I just shared a little bit about mine, do you owe your interest? I'm sorry, I'm going to start again. What experience or in your personal life influenced your decision to tackle money and politics through your work? Was there a turning point, a specific policy, a specific case? You know, what led you into this field, or was it a happy accident, I guess?
It's such an important question. And for me, especially, it really came as I became a much more sophisticated organizer or more experienced organizer and started to learn about systemic issues and power dynamics. It's pretty quickly you start to realize that the same people that pollute our environment are the same people that have monopolized elected officials to make sure that that is enabled. So pretty quickly, and not just in the environment. You know, I have worked in variety of issues, and you know, in my career, in education, the same thing. The same people that have access to elected officials are driving the conversation. The same with immigrants, and I work with undocumented immigrants that can't even vote. You know, so that just like learning how the system is just set up for a certain group to dominate the conversation. How do they dominate the conversation? They donate to political campaigns, they get people elected, they have independent expenditures that they can spend against you or for you. They bundle their money. They bring their wives and their friends, you know, to donate. Every time in Los Angeles, you hear sometimes these reports in the news. And not long ago, they had a story about who's been contributing to, you know, to the more established candidates. Right now, we're in elections in like the majority of California in the country. And who contributes? And now it's not the lobbyists, because at least in LA, we have put in place more strict regulations for lobbyists. But guess what? Who's donating now? Their wives, their kids, their sisters, brothers, you know, like all the other family members. So we haven't really, you know, we haven't really leveraged or maybe just even diminish the power and the access that they have. And you know, in organizing, we talk about us, organized people versus organized money, because maybe we don't have a lot of money and we're not rich, but we have each other and we have our community and we have all the things that we can do if we rally up together and fight for something that is important to us. So very, very soon I started to understand, and it wasn't until maybe when I became a commissioner. I mean, people used to always say, you know, one day you should run for office. And I was like, oh no, you have no idea what's that like. I work with elected officials, they're the worst, you know? And it wasn't until I was confronted with that question about, well, if none of us does it, so then they're gonna keep doing it, you know? And that's what kind of like motivated me to get involved. And I have been talking about, actually before I even remotely thought about running for office, I used to talk about that we used to have free, like the campaigns running for office should be free. That should be completely no money at all. That this should be something that is our civic duty, and that we should get our message out there, and that we will be so involved in the community that we're with or in, that people would just naturally know. And this caused a lot of debate. I mean, even today's Representative Nane Barragan, who's in Congress, she used to comment every time I will make a commentary about, like, we need to run campaigns that are no money. And she will always say this. And it wasn't until I ran myself for office that I understood, okay, it's going to be really hard for us to stop them from using their millions. But maybe what if we give our people something too, so that they can expand? And that's why I thought this idea of the democracy money, whatever we're going to call it, was like so important. Or democracy money. And it's exciting to be part of kind of finding those ways to like you empower people to take part of the process as we debilitate the other side's influence and money.
Yeah, and I love your point about communities have power, because to me, if you give all the communities the same amount of democracy dollars, then you're empowering communities to use that in order to put candidates on the ballot that they support. So it's a good way to look at it. So I'm going to ask the same question to Estevan. What experience in your personal life influenced your decision? Because you've been tackling money in politics not only from democracy dollars, but through other aspects of your work. So what drove you to this?
I think so. The roots for me came from when I was going to college. I studied political theory, and so I think there's just something fundamental about the theory of what democracy should be and how it should be practiced, that you can see how fundamental the influence of money would be in that process. But it wasn't until I was living abroad in Ecuador at a time when the former President Palacio was thinking about signing a free trade agreement with the United States, and I saw the way that the country responded, that the people really turned out and protested and demanded that this agreement not be signed, because it would have decimated the agricultural sector, which was fundamental to a lot of the community where I was living. And just witnessing how strongly people responded and how fundamental this influence of money was in the fact that this was even being considered by the government. That was something that really, I think, crystallized for me. And then seeing the fact that the people were successful in getting that to not be signed, that the president eventually backed down. But it was only because people were so mobilized and organized to make their voices heard. So I think that was one moment that really helped me understand how fundamental this was to everything else that we care about. And so coming back to Seattle in 2007, I knew that I wanted to work in money and politics reform, because I saw this as being fundamental to everything I cared about regarding healthcare policy or housing or criminal justice reform or climate justice. That the impediments we were facing to be able to actually fix some of these problems and address the climate crisis, the emergency that we were currently in, was in large part driven by wealthy interests who were benefiting from the status quo and didn't really want to allow some of these policies to advance that would diminish their influence, or in the short term limit the amount of money that they were able to make. And so that was, for me, it just all made sense when I saw it in those terms, that oftentimes money and politics reform is treated as a separate issue. Like, people care about healthcare, they care about education, they care about talked about money and politics reform, and that's always everyone's fourth or fifth priority on the list because these other issues are more viscerally connected to their lives. You feel it more viscerally and urgently. But at the same time, I think what we need to do is reframe this, where this is not a separate issue. This is fundamental. This is a fundamental component of the fights that we're waging currently and that we all find ourselves in. That this is just a fundamental piece that allows us to build more power to then advance those important policies that we care about. So that was what drew me to this work, to begin organizing around money and politics reform, and then ultimately to land on the Democracy Voucher program in Seattle.
Well, that's a very good story, actually. Very interesting to see it from outside of the country. To see other countries struggling with that as well. All right, Tom, we're going to kick that same question to you. Would you share with us what experience in your personal life influenced your decisions to tackle money in politics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't know if there is one experience, one specific experience, but it's something that I've reflected on, especially in the last few years, where it feels like once a month we get a new apocalypse, right? And there's some massive crisis that could demand all of our energy, right? And all of our political activism could be focused on climate or on racial justice or on the pandemic or on, stopping President Trump from trying to steal the election, right? And every one of these crises could just absolutely take up all of our time. And so the question is, how can money in politics be our top issue, right? Does it crack that list? And the answer is exactly what Estevan said. If we care about all these other things, we cannot make progress on them without fixing our campaign finance system. It's not a silver bullet, but it makes everything else easier. It unlocks progress for all these other issues that we care about. And so that's where I come at it from. I'm someone who cares about climate, right? Who cares about racial justice, who cares about these other topics. If we don't pass campaign finance reform and democracy reform generally, we're not going to be able to make progress on those other issues. Or when we do, it's going to be painstaking and slow, right? Whereas if you had a democracy voucher system in place, for example, you could imagine, if folks want to organize on some issue, not only do they have the people power, but all of a sudden they have money power behind them too. And they can use that to influence candidates. You'd have candidates running for office without having to spend 20 to 40 hours a week on the phone with wealthy donors. You could have people running for office by knocking on doors in their communities. And so those are the things that get me excited about this program. And that's why even amid, our once monthly apocalypse, this is still what I'm most passionate about and what I choose to spend my time on.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what so many of us feel. If you listen to all the stories, everybody's gotten to the point where other things they care about are stymied and stuck and can't move forward until we solve this one issue. And so even though the stories of those experiences are a little bit different, they all have kind of a common thread of, I want to see big things happen for all of my community, and I can't see them because there's a block. This is in the way. This is what we have to get past. And I think a comment Estevan made that I thought was really important is this idea of reframing, that we look at so many things as a binary choice. I can have a library or democracy vouchers or dollars. I can have schools or democracy. And we need to stop looking at it as an either or and recognize that campaign finance reform in the term of small dollar financing is kind of like infrastructure. And that's been a point that's been made on a lot of things. And I understand that people struggle with that a little bit, but it is how we reassert control. And until we do something about it, we won't get that control back. The next thing that I wanted to do now that we work through that question is actually ask everyone who's in the audience to send us a little bit of information. We're gonna have another poll later, but the first one is just a question that you can answer in the chat. And I'm gonna ask you to answer it in the chat while I go through a couple of slides for new folks that aren't 100% sure how a democracy voucher or dollar program would work. I'm just gonna spend 2 or 3 minutes explaining it before we ask the panelists their next question, in order to make sure that we're kind of clear on how this general policy would work, because I know folks are somewhat new to this concept still. So the survey question is, what was that TV show where they would say the survey question is, what did you think when you heard the term democracy dollars or democracy vouchers? What did you think that was the first time you heard it, before anybody explained it to you? And so I'll be curious to see those answers in the chat, because it's helpful for us to kind of know when we're explaining the policy, how do we explain it? How does that connect? How does that help us reframe, as Estevan said, what this policy is and what it can do? So if you all can take it away from there, I'm going to share my screen again and just share a couple of slides on what the voucher program is, how it works, for those who are new to it before we go on to our next question. So the general goal, as you have probably established from our conversation so far, is that we want to use a democracy dollar or democracy voucher program, which gives a certificate to every member of the community, similar to giving them an opportunity to vote. They would also have the opportunity to give those certificates to candidates running for office in order to allow those candidates to run for office. And the goal of this is to increase civic engagement by getting more people to be involved in the political process because they know now they have more power. It's also to give voters more choice because people who are considering running for office but don't have the cash resources or the access to funds now can. And also to improve transparency because when you're running your campaigns through a small dollar financing program, all of the money is on the table, I guess is a good way of saying it. You see how much money candidates are receiving, you see how much they're spending, and we've actually collaborated with a group called Open San Diego to create that experience for voters here locally in San Diego, because transparency goes a long way towards increasing trust in government. So the way this would change our elections for candidates is they would still have to qualify through signatures, which they have to do now. They have to collect a certain number of signatures in order to get on the ballot, or they have to pay a registration fee. In order to get democracy dollars or democracy vouchers, they would have to turn in in our case, we were proposing several hundred signatures. Each city would make their own decision on that. They would also have to agree to specific campaign finance limits, agree to not fundraise for PACs and several other ethics issues. They would also have to agree to participate in debates so that they couldn't run for office without being in the public and expressing their views publicly. And then they would get to collect democracy dollars from their community in order to run for office. Voters' experience would change because now you're going to choose who to give your democracy dollars to or your democracy vouchers. You're going to listen to candidates in public debates because they have to have them and they have to attend. You'll get to see the funding online, so it will all be out in the open and not hidden secretly. And then you'll get a vote for a candidate who is not beholden to big donor dollars, and hopefully a candidate that you helped get on the ballot by contributing your democracy dollars or your democracy vouchers. So we think it's a pretty important change, and we think it will do a whole lot for the city of San Diego and the city of LA and other communities that choose to adopt it. And if we get this passed, some of the things that we could see happening, I have a couple of statistics here from Seattle. I'm going to have to go out of order here. And Estevan can speak to this when we get to his questions, but I just wanted to share a few numbers because we talk about these impacts and we talk about, well, how do you know that this is going to have that impact? Well, we know because Seattle has been running elections this way for a number of years, and they are doing a fabulous job of collecting data and analyzing the impact of this policy on their community. So we know that the difference between their 2015 campaign in terms of traditional donors and total donors has been astronomical. They had 8,234 people donating to campaigns in 2015. That means less than 1% of their population decided who was going to be on those ballots last year. Since then, you'll see this number, the 25,000, the total number of donors, including democracy dollar democracy voucher donors, 25,000, 45,000, and then here in 2021, we are at, I'm sorry, oh, I flipped my numbers around. It's the top, the 20,000, the 38,000, and the 46,700. So you see that we've gone from 8,000 to those numbers being the totals. They don't have the 2021 yet. They haven't published that for the total number of traditional donors so that we can do that last little bit of math. But you see that in 2021, we were just in terms of voucher donors, which is the top column on the right, we exceeded the total combined donors for voucher donors and traditional donors. So when you talk about impact, you talk about all of those community members being engaged and active participants in who is going to be on their ballot. That's a pretty staggering number. And there's a lot more data that we could share, but to me, those numbers speak so powerfully to it that's a good start in terms of starting to talk about the impact of democracy dollars. And so we wanted to, I'll go back here quickly to these, to the panel survey results, and then we'll go to our next question. Tom says we can pass it under any name that we decide. Let's see, coupons. Oh, that's another one that I had not heard before. Yep. Or a government bond program. That's good to know. That I hadn't heard that before, but that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we got a couple other ones in there, and we can ask for a few more later. So I not heard the government bonds, but I see Esteban's comment here that they use vouchers in Seattle because of polling, which I think is a great way to make decisions to make sure you're communicating properly within the community that you're speaking with. We haven't done any formal polling, but we've done some informal polling where we ask 40 or 50 people who worked in the political space, and that's how come we started with democracy dollars, but we've had several other names proposed. And here in just a few minutes, I'm going to give us a quiz and let everybody look at those other ideas and see what they think. So my next question to the panelists, and I think we'll mix up the order here, so maybe we'll start with Tom, and then we'll go to Estevan, and then we'll go to Aura, is the question about what did you think the first time you heard about democracy vouchers or democracy dollars? In Estevan's case, I think it's going to be a little bit more is how did you end up there as opposed to starting there? Because my understanding is in Seattle, they didn't start with this program. They started with an idea and they developed the program. So his answer is going to be very different. And then what understanding about the idea caused you to become a champion of the program? And we've talked about this a little bit before, so feel free to elaborate. So we'll go ahead and start with Tom.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I can pinpoint the first moment that I heard the word democracy vouchers. I think I must have seen some early article about what Seattle was doing around 2015 when Estevan and the folks up there got it passed. I will say my initial reaction was, this is a great idea. This is a program about getting a set of donors that's reflective of the population, which is true, but that's also not the entire picture, right? The neat thing about working in this space now is seeing the vast array of different benefits this program brings. So absolutely, one benefit is the diversity of donors. So in LA, and I think in Seattle, and I'm sure in San Diego, in LA, donors tend to be wealthy, they tend to be white, they come from a small set of neighborhoods, they're not reflective of the city as a whole. And democracy vouchers will help address that. But there are other benefits too that you often don't hear about when you first learn about the program. So for example, more candidates can run for office with democracy vouchers. And so you get a wider set of folks running, even if they don't have connections to those wealthy white donors that normally you would need. Another great benefit is laid out in this study that Estevan just put in the chat. And by the way, if you do anything tonight, I highly suggest you click on this study and just go to page 2 and just read the breakdown. One of my favorite studies ever, just for those numbers. Because what they found was that in Seattle, after using a voucher, people became 6 to 10 times more likely to vote if they were a low propensity voter before, which is huge, right? And that's a separate benefit from the diversity of donors, from more candidates. What that shows is that these are people who were previously disengaged, maybe cynical, maybe said things like, none of the politicians care about me, they never come to my neighborhood. But now all of a sudden you use a voucher and you feel like you have a voice, and then you're bought in. And so really that was, working in this space, that's been the realization for me, is finding all of these other benefits on top of the main things that we all love about this program, these other generative effects that it has.
Yeah, that's a really great example too of how you could potentially vote for this program or want this program to go forward for one reason, and then get a lot of trickle down impacts on the community. So. All right, so Estevan, I'm going to ask you that question, but again, a little differently. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you started out trying to do before you landed on the idea to do democracy vouchers.
Sure. Yeah, the Honest Election Seattle campaign in 2015 was really our sort of third try at passing public financing in Seattle. So a group of us, as I mentioned, we started organizing around money and politics reform in Seattle. This is when I came to that work, but found a group of folks, and we started to launch a campaign in 2008 that would have pursued a matching system, similar to if folks are familiar with New York City's model, and it's practiced elsewhere as well, but like a 6-to-1 super match. LA has a version of that as well. That where you contribute, maybe $10, and then it would be matched 6-to-1 with public funds. So your $10 contribution would be worth $70 to the candidate. So it was a way to incentivize candidates to reach more voters and not just spend all their time dialing for dollars and talking to the wealthiest donors that they could find. And so that was what we were pursuing in 2008, and again in 2013 we ran a campaign. That campaign fell just narrowly short. We didn't actually pursue the campaign in 2008. We pulled back because the economy tanked. But then in 2013 we actually made it to the ballot, and that measure was just a bare super match. There were no other provisions. There was also not much of a campaign because it came up kind of quickly. Everyone thought we were going to lose in 2013, and we ended up falling just 1,400 votes short out of 500,000 cast. We got 49.63% of the vote that year. And what that meant for us, though, was because everyone thought that the measure was going to get demolished at the ballot, we were able to fail forward and come back to this idea and explore other ways that we could move this, because people realized that we missed an opportunity in 2013. And so a lot of folks came to the table. There were a number of funders and local and national folks who wanted to jump in and see how we could take another run at public financing in Seattle. And because of that, we were able to build a much stronger coalition in 2015. And we decided that we didn't want to have to go through city council again. Previously, we were pursuing city council. We convinced city council to refer a measure to the ballot. And we realized that if we don't rely on city council, we don't have to worry about what's politically palatable for existing council members. And so for that reason, we decided to explore what it would take to launch a ballot initiative and just collect signatures and put it straight to the people and see what people, what folks wanted. And it was through that process where the question of democracy vouchers came up. A lot of us were familiar with Lawrence Lessig's writings around democracy vouchers and just this concept. But because it hadn't been done anywhere yet, we were a little unsure if this was going to be the best course of action for us. But we went ahead and did some polling to see how voters would respond, and we found that it polled the highest among progressives and among conservatives. There's an element of this that tends to resonate with libertarians in particular, and I think because it really is a market-based solution. It's a way for the candidate who does the most work, who has the best pitch, who can go out and convince enough people to give them their vouchers, they're going to be more successful. It's not somebody in a back room, sort of this idea of somebody writing a check, some government bureaucrat that you have no access to, even if that's not an accurate portrayal. There's this sense that I think that you have more power in that process. And so when we found that it polled the highest, we also realized that this was a much more equitable solution, that you don't have to have $10 in the first place in order to participate. And if our goal was really to break the cycle of disengagement that we see so often, where communities of color and low-income folks, young people are ignored by traditional candidates because they're focused on the 50% plus one of most likely voters, we know that those voters tend to be whiter, older, more male, wealthier. And so by definition, that's going to exclude significant segments of the population. When those candidates aren't showing up at their doorstep, it's much less likely that those communities are going to turn out and vote in the first place. And when they don't turn out, it justifies not reaching out to them again next year. So it's the cycle that perpetuates itself. And we realized that if we could make everybody a potential donor, it could really help break that cycle by incentivizing candidates to show up at those doors. And as Tom mentioned, we're seeing really significant returns on that sort of an approach where people are much more likely to vote after using those vouchers. When they vote, they're much more likely to have somebody show up on their doorstep the next year, because now they're seen as a likely voter and a likely donor. And so that's what really drew us to this model, and it's been exciting to see some of those results really play out.
Well, and I think that getting more people engaged and participatory in what we're doing, politically, and again, politically is the policy that runs our community, right? So this is how we make decisions. I think that's really important right now. So we might even be able to get more people on board, kind of seeing those numbers come in. So, so next up, going back to Aura, what did you think the first time you heard the term democracy dollars? And what did you really think? Like, did you think this was some crazy program, or did it immediately click with you, or were you questioning what it was as well?
I remember having this conversation with Tom and, kind of the team, and I just remember saying, we need to find a better name. Because I think at first I heard democracy dollars. And I was like, well, this goes both ways. Why they're not Democrats?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, I mean, that is real too. Like, I mean, maybe not in LA, maybe not in Seattle, that is a little more progressive, but you start establishing this type of policies and, other people also get involved, and get with it. So like, for me, vouchers, for example, I just think about the more conservative people saying, oh, you see, now you're going to give more money to poor people because they're already getting all their money. And I don't know what they're talking about, but, they're already getting all this money and you're already giving them everything and they want now more, so definitely we need to work out the rebranding there. But once I learned about the concept, I thought it was brilliant, because I hear over and over moms, community members, teachers that always say, well, they don't listen to us because we don't have the money, because we don't have the power. And that's the beauty of kind of working together with people and community organizing, that you can empower people and unleash that power that is within all of us, and it gets activated when we work together. So whether we call it coupons or money or take your whatever it is that we lend, calling them, I think it's just a step closer to get more people involved in the civic process. And that really is what it matters here. And and again, having, I feel you guys have all heard that expression of, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And some other people have said, well, you got to bring a chair, you make your own table. So basically, that's what we're kind of doing here. We're bringing the chairs and we're having our own table, since, we haven't had a table made for us, really never. So, this is extremely exciting, and it's empowering for a lot of people that, again, maybe have never even had vouchers of any kind, in their lives, and I work hard. I think about, in my community, all the gardeners, the people that, clean homes, the real working class people, teachers that are buying supplies to make sure that their students, have what they need to succeed. So I'm thinking about them, and what would it be like if they get $100 and they can just suddenly go to an elected official and say, well, I have this extra, so it can be very empowering.
Yeah, very, very engaging. I think that that's really important. So I'm actually going to propose that we do something that is going to mix two democracy reform efforts together for just a second here. And I think you all know that if you work in the democracy reform space or the money and politics space, you have to be very persistent. Estevan's story about the multiple tries, I mean, these things take a lot of effort, they take a lot of time, they don't happen overnight. In spite of the amazing benefits that you can bring, you still have to do a lot of convincing, a lot of selling, a lot of collaboration. So I put together a poll. It's a ranked choice voting poll because, we just need to mix all these things together and see what happens. I just put the link in the chat. There's no rush. We'll let you guys fill this out as we go through the next couple of questions, but I put several different names that we've seen around the community. One of them is voter choice vouchers. Another one is voter dollars, which I believe they're using in Connecticut. I put an option for other, and then you can put yours in the comments, because again, we don't really care what we call it, but communication is important, because we want to make sure that people who are coming to the polls to vote for this policy, or hearing about it at the grocery store or on TV, we want to make sure it's accessible. If we have this great policy and we can't get people to believe in it the same way we do, because we don't take the time to figure out the right language to communicate it, then we've just kind of missed an opportunity. So as passionate as we are, if we don't nail our communication, we won't get over that last hurdle. So I put that in the chat. Feel free to go in and do your ranking of the options. And then at the end of this, I'll go back and take a look at it and tell us where we land. So my last question before we start taking audience questions, I actually have a different question for each of the panelists. And so I think we'll go, let's see, we'll start with Estevan. And my question is, what has surprised you the most about the community impact to the voucher program in the years since it passed in Seattle? Either a policy that was enacted, or a person who got elected, or just feedback from a community member. What has surprised you the most since that has passed that you didn't expect?
I think what has surprised me the most is how successful, to be honest, how successful the program has been. We were really conservative when we were setting our own expectations back in 2015 about how quickly we would see the program take off, how much of an increase we would be able to experience, within the first few cycles. We thought it would take quite a while for people to really understand how the program worked. And I think it's one of the challenges that we continue to face is that we've gone from about 1.5% of the city's population contributing to campaigns to over 8%, or right around 8% of the city's population contributing to campaigns, which is massive. We've never seen that sort of a dramatic swing from any single policy anywhere in the country. And currently Seattle has the highest percentage of its population contributing to political campaigns of anywhere in the country. And so I think that's really meaningful. But it's still 8%. And so I think, if you don't understand the context of why that's significant, then I think people who are just sort of viewing this from the outside can look at that number, and it's easy to think like, oh, well, it's just 8%. It's not that significant, without really understanding how successful it really has been. I mean, as you mentioned, we've seen such a dramatic increase in the number of people using the program and contributing to candidates. It's now become like the default way that candidates are running. We had 53 out of 55 candidates in 2019 declare for the program, which was also the largest number of candidates we've ever had in the city. So I think the fact that and then Tom referenced some of the increases in voter participation among sort of low propensity voters. I think the fact that people are using it so quickly has been really exciting to see. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's a pretty exciting surprise. So my next question is going to be going to Tom, and my question is a little bit the opposite. Estevan just shared with us the kind of runaway success that they had with the program, exceeding expectations. But as you researched your book, and knowing that a lot of folks listening are interested in pursuing this policy, did you get a sense for campaigns that tried and didn't quite get across the finish line with democracy vouchers or democracy dollars, as to what the primary opposition was, what the messaging was, and either why they were successful with that messaging, or ideas for working around it?
Yeah, the interesting thing is there's not a lot of active public opposition to this policy. And Estevan could speak to what they found in Seattle, but my understanding is there were a lot of folks behind the scenes who didn't really like it. There were some sitting council members who didn't support it, but publicly felt like they couldn't oppose this because it was so obviously in the public interest. And some of them actually decided they were going to retire when it passed. Now, in terms of campaigns that have been run, often the biggest barrier they need to overcome is, first of all, just the public knowledge about the program. Amy, you've spoken to this before, that on issues like ranked choice voting, there's so much more public awareness, right? One, it's been passed more places, but it's also just discussed on news shows. It's discussed with comedians. Hassan Minhaj did his whole episode on ranked choice voting, and we don't have that yet with democracy vouchers. So that's one step, and that's something that some folks here can help fill, and that's part of the purpose of panels like this. And then the other piece is overcoming, I think, the cynicism. People are broadly supportive of fixing money in politics. There's one poll from the New York Times, something like 90% of Americans agree that money in politics is a problem, but often people don't believe that any solution is possible. People will say things like, well, of course special interests are a problem, but as long as special interests are controlled, how are we ever going to change that? Why would they change the system that benefits them? And the answer is, well, we can run ballot initiatives, right? That's part of the answer. And we can advocate, and we can fight these battles over time. And we're not going to win right away, but we really can pass this policy and have a better system. And so I think that, a lot of folks come in interested, but a little bit skeptical that a reform can really have this many positive effects, and that it's on us to make the case that no, look at the data in Seattle, read a little bit about it. It really can have these effects.
Yeah. In speaking to that, one of the comments I hear a lot is, it won't matter until we get rid of Citizens United. It's as though we've created this sort of blanket, we can't do anything. It's kind of hopeless until we fix that one policy. And I like to think of democracy dollars as, in our video, they have this great animation where the candidate is shielded by basically a rainbow of democracy dollars from the big corporate interest. And so while we can't get rid of Citizens United, we can create a path, right? A protected path where good candidates can get through and community members can participate, where we're using our own dollars to kind of create that. So I think, to your point, that cynicism is potentially one of our biggest hurdles, is getting people to feel optimistic about it.
I think I also want to offer another piece that I learned when I ran for city council, which is not only that we need to overthrow Citizens United for many other reasons than this one, but also, the way our campaign finance is set up to allow corporations and just people to run independent expenditures is very complicated. Because, I even thought about, well, why don't we create a policy to stop that? Because a lot of candidates, even unions, special interests, rich people, all sorts of people come and put their money together and do these independent expenditures for candidates. And this is not aligned or in collaboration with the campaign, but still it happens. But it's protected under the First Amendment of freedom of speech. So how do we navigate that? And I think this might be the second wave or the 3.0 source of this type of work. And like, what do we do when sometimes candidates maybe fundraise enough to be competitive, but then all this other money comes outside of your campaign to support or not support you? So how do we navigate, that piece that, you can challenge in court, and basically anyone that has money that can open a PAC can do that on behalf, of a candidate. So something for us to think about as we, overthrow Citizens United. We have really bigger fish to fry in order to get more people involved and to really give power dollars to everyday people to participate in the civic process.
Well, and I like to think, and this is a very long timeline, but if we were to implement this policy broadly, we would transform the types of candidates who ran and succeeded. So the people sitting in the chairs making those decisions about how can we get rid of money in politics would be elected differently. And it might be easier to push them and kind of transform the whole system. But that's a very long play to get there, right? Where you kind of change the whole face of government by changing how people get there in the first place and changing the types of people who get there in the first place. And I think, Aura, you said this a little bit earlier, but just to ask, how do you think it would have been to run a campaign with democracy vouchers or democracy dollars in LA? Like, how would that have changed your campaigning and your competition?
So, I was in the category of, the person that did the most door knocking. In fact, the LA Times followed me one day to door knock. I kind of developed that reputation, and they did a little story about that. And for me, the field work was the most important. And you have no idea how many people discourage me. They're like, you need to sit and make money so that you can send mailers, so that you can do the traditional thing. I'm like, that's not going to work for me. I'm not a traditional candidate. So even if I was to raise all the money, it's not going to work for me, So I think if all of those doors that I knocked, and people that were excited, and people that said, you're the first person in my life that have come and knock on my door, ever, maybe those dollars would have made a huge difference. And remember, I ran in a district with 250,000 other, members of my community is how large my district is, where 150,000 were registered voters, like likely voters. So imagine if all those people will have $100, let's say $100, let's say $10. I mean, multiply 100,000, or let's say half of those people will be down for me. 50,000 people times $10. I mean, that would have been a huge incentive for, for my campaign. And for the people that showed up out of nowhere and said, she came knocking on my door. I saw her at the supermarket. I got a Instagram, a Facebook ad from her. I like that she is for the environment. I like that, this and that. Imagine if they all had their 10, 100, whatever amount of dollars, and would have said, well, I want to give it to her. I mean, it was so hard for me to raise money because I also ran against somebody very powerful and very entrenched in the political process. One of the most powerful African-American elected officials in the state. 30-year politician that now is indicted with 22 counts by the FBI. We don't have a city council member right now. And he just got elected in 2020, it was extremely difficult to run against someone so established, to not have, to be and not even born, Afro-Latina in this city, running, and also having somebody that was neutralizing so many people to not support me, that would traditionally support me. So I think that democracy vouchers, or the dollar for the voter dollars, the dollar for the people, whatever it is that we end up calling it, I think it can make a tremendous difference in someone like me, for example.
Yeah, and what you described, when we talk to voters in our community, I'm sure it's no different than any other, is what they want in a candidate is that passion that you just discussed, that I'm running because I care about the people in my supermarket and I have so much to offer, and you're doing it anyway in spite of how hard it is, how much of a challenge it is to run for office. And then we put up a system where all the people who have the good ideas and the good values and the energy and the enthusiasm and the passion for their community, they're kind of kneecapped from the very beginning, because the system is really set up to more favor and benefit establishment folks and folks who have access to money. So it's a real disconnect, I think, between what voters want and then what they say they want in a candidate and what they end up getting. And the only way to really fix it is to give voters the power to choose the candidates, all voters, not just a few. So, but what you described is exactly what we think all the voters really, really want. So we're coming up on 7 o'clock, and I want to make sure that if anybody has any questions, there's a lot of great resources and things that I'm put in the chat. But please, if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat. If you're struggling with the chat, feel free to unmute yourself and share the question. Although with a panel like this that's so knowledgeable and excited about the policy, sometimes we get to the end and we've answered all the questions, so that's possible too. While everybody's thinking, I'm putting resources in the chat that you should be able to copy and paste. Excellent. Excellent. More resources. Everybody needs to take a minute to copy things out of the chat. So I'll do a couple of closing things while we see if anybody has any questions. But as you know, there are several active campaigns for this policy in the community, one in San Diego, one in LA, and one in Oakland. As Tom, I believe, mentioned, public awareness is really our enemy, we think, at this point in our community. Our goal is to really build a groundswell of demand for this policy by just talking about it. And so one of the things our local chapter has been really organized around that you will find if you go to the democracydollar.info website is a short video that explains it in 3 minutes. And we really try to put ourselves in the perspective of how it would transform voting and campaigning. We all get really tired of kind of the nasty campaigns, and we really wanted to do some positive messaging around how this could feel and look in our community and really create that visual for people so that they could really start to see themselves operating differently around campaign finance. Continuing with that, and so please share that. We would love to share that around the country because it is such a key education piece, and we're working on some backup to that. So we have the 1-minute short film that we've also created. We also have 3 animations that we're getting ready to produce that will touch on some of these key topics from an animated standpoint. That'll be about 20 seconds. And really all of this goes towards that public awareness. You know, until we convince people that this is amazing, we can't have it. And we already know it's amazing, but we just need to educate people on the fact that this policy even exists, whatever we decide to call it. So anything you can do around sharing those is really important. And as a continuation to that idea that we know the community, we think the community will rally around it more as they understand it more, we're actually launching a mock democracy dollar campaign in April. So our next event will be in April, and we will be giving everyone physical and digital democracy dollars. And they will be written out. We've done them before. They're super fun, although more fun probably not in a pandemic year. Where you go to somebody who's running for office and you basically get your picture taken with them. Here's our little certificate from last time. You get your picture taken with them, giving them the certificate, or you can mail it to them, or you can give it to them online. And it basically says, I'm a voter who believes every community should be able to choose their candidates using democracy dollars. And I'm asking you to endorse this policy before you run for office. So we'll be circulating those in April. Just like last time, we'll put all the folks, hopefully we'll be able to run a little bit longer. Last time we had to cut it short. All of the candidates currently running for city council who endorse us will then be, or who support the policy will then be listed. And then of course, all the photos of everyone will be posted up. And we really think it'll be exciting for people to have this opportunity. You're meeting a potential elected official, you already have a policy in your hands to talk to them about, and you can really kind of get the feel of what that's like to be more engaged and more civically involved in that policy. So that's the next phase of our campaign here in San Diego. If anybody's interested in that, we would love to see you. And then now that I'm going back, oh, we have a couple of questions. So I am going to start with Patrine, and her question is, how effective might voter or democracy dollars have in influencing and electing politicians compared to PACs? So if you compare the two policies, I don't know who wants to take that, but it will.
I can just jump in, and then obviously others can share their thoughts too. I think this can be hugely effective. You know, this is a mechanic for everyday people to have candidates come to their door, knowing that every door they knock on is potentially $100 for their campaign, right? Versus today, whereas if you want to fundraise, you know, candidates will spend their time on the phone dialing rich donors or courting PACs, trying to get them to make independent expenditures on their behalf. Even with this policy, you're always going to have some candidates who are going to want to run with the old system. They're more comfortable with big money. And so, you know, it's not a silver bullet. It wouldn't be true to say this is going to eliminate that entirely. But what it can do is it can take away their incumbency advantage, right? It can mean that if you're represented by one of those politicians who's running with big money behind them, with PACs behind them, well, now you have the option to support a challenger and to help make that challenger a viable candidate.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything Tom said. I think we are limited in how much we can regulate or limit PAC spending. But what we can do is dilute that influence by amplifying more people and making sure that more people are able to participate in the process. And in doing so, it's not just, we are, the metric we're looking for isn't just changing incumbency rates, where we're seeing incumbents suddenly not be viable. That's if that's the goal, we're not necessarily seeing that, and that really isn't what our intention, at least has been in Seattle. It's really to change how you're running for office. So even if you are an incumbent, you still have that the benefit of name recognition. You have the support of the people who got you there. So you're already going to start out with an advantage. But because there are more people who can participate in the process, it changes how even you as an incumbent will run for office. So you are also going to be reaching out to more people and having to take positions on issues that maybe you wouldn't have had to take in the past. And so, whether we're looking at, if we're looking at and not just changing who is in office, but how people get there. And so even if we do see some incumbents being successful, they're having to operate their campaigns a little bit differently. And so this actually gets to one of the next questions around the influence of Amazon's investment in 2019, where they put massive historic amounts of money into the city council races, and ended up with one solitary race that they won, that their favored candidate was successful in. And I think that really told an important story in Seattle, that what we saw was a lot more candidates who were able to compete with that money because of the voucher program. And the story that was told was, you have these grassroots candidates who are reaching, more individual residents, and then you have these other candidates who, whether they asked for it or not, were receiving massive amounts of money from these large corporations in the city. And it backfired for Amazon because people saw that as a stain on that particular candidate, to the point that some candidates were actually coming out against Amazon, saying that we don't want this money, we're not actually trying to take this money. People were actually trying to back away. And so I think one of the pieces that this points out for me is that when we talk about limiting the influence of money in politics, we can do it legally, where we're passing policy and actually restricting the way that money flows, but we can also make that corporate money toxic. And that's another really important route, where we can tell this story of why this is a problem and make it so that that corporate money is no longer as effective. And we need both of those strategies to be implemented in order to be really successful in this fight, because as Tom said, this isn't a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything automatically, but it's a really important step in the right direction.
That's a really interesting point, the idea that it goes back to a market solution where the people are rejecting candidates who take money from certain vehicles. Again, that goes back to transparency. You have to be able to see that that's happening. But I love the idea that we as a voting public would reject that money and make it difficult for candidates to win for taking it, because that we can do on our own. We don't need a legal solution to make that happen. So I think that's the end of our questions. And since we are at our 7:15, I'm going to let everybody move on with their evening. I wanted to say two quick things. And then if any of the panelists have a last item where they felt like they didn't get something in, we'll also do that as well. But first of all, thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate it, because this is very painstaking work. And it is nice to be able to reach new people and to have more conversations around it. And as we've discussed, democracy dollars, in my view, is the most powerful policy that no one has ever heard of. And while we might have all heard of it and be really passionate about it, our job is to be ambassadors for this idea, and to really, as they did in Seattle, kind of workshop it and develop it and make sure that we push it forward, because we can't leave things the way that we are. It is important that we have an equitable democracy, and it is not equitable in its current shape or form. And I believe this would be a huge step forward. So if you have the capacity to spend some time, sharing the video and staying engaged with us, we really appreciate it. All right, everyone good?
Thanks for having us.
All good? And thank you guys very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. All right.
Thank you.
Have a great night. We'll get the recording up in the next day or two for anybody who wants to listen after.
Hi, everybody. Thanks.